Well, hi everyone. Thanks for coming to our talk today. It's our privilege. I know you guys are as excited about telemetry data as I am. So we're gonna jump right into it. But I just want to preface the talk by saying we started on this journey about a year ago in January when we started looking at all the telemetry data that we have and trying to figure out the best way that we can communicate that to our customers. And since I'm math challenged and not very good with stats, I had to rope Kimberly into helping me out to make sense of all this data. And so this presentation is kind of the culmination of the journey that we've been on as we've been digging deep into this data.
So we'll go ahead and start off with introducing ourselves. My name is Kimberly Goody, and I currently manage the financial crime analysis team within the FireEye Intelligence Unit. Prior to this, I was working at the National Cyber Forensic and Training Alliance in Pittsburgh, which is also where I did my master's program in security and intelligence studies.
I'm Nart Villeneuve. I run the threat pursuit team, also in FireEye Intelligence. We do all of the botnet tracking, code family modeling, everything cybercrime, but that's not where I got my start. I actually first got started in this field at the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto, looking at politically motivated targeted attacks against human rights groups and the Tibetan community. I was at Trend Micro for a while, kind of doing the same thing, also looking at espionage, particularly China Nexus groups. And when I came over to FireEye, I was looking China Nexus groups, Syrian groups, Iranian groups, and then I discovered cybercrime and thought, hey, I'm gonna jump right into cybercrime and look at all of the data that we have and see if I can make sense out of what we're looking at. So these are some headlines that we grab. You know, every quarter, at the end of every quarter, at the end of every year, companies put out these reports. They're really awesome PDFs, sweet graphics, lots of pie charts, eye-popping headlines. But what does that data really mean to organizations that want to put it into practice? So we hear about an increase or a decrease in a certain type of malware or certain type of technique. And how can we actually affect our operations? And so one of the things that we're trying to do is dig deeper and try to understand what is the underlying data that's going into these reports, and how can we accurately and critically interpret what we're reading so it can actually inform our operations.
And so as you'll notice from some of these headlines up here even, you can see in what would be your top left-hand corner that ransomware attacks are both prevailing and declining in 2018. How can that possibly be? How can both of these headlines be right? In some cases, they might not be, but in other cases, the source of the data might inform what these headlines are saying. So in general, there's three categories of data that are contributing to what is being reported. You have survey data, which is highly subjective because you're essentially relying on people to provide honest answers and opinions to certain questions. Then you also have breach data. The Verizon annual report is a great example of this. It's looking at tens of thousands of incidents that occurred over the past year and looking at that information and categorizing that for its consumers. And then you also have telemetry data, which is going to be the focus of our presentation. And there's a number of problems with telemetry data just in itself that can contribute to these conflicting headlines. So before we get into what some of those problems are, we wanted to briefly mention what are some of the things that telemetry data can be useful for. So when we look at the different categories of questions it can answer, these include, visibility, probability, and impact. So it might give you some visibility into what other organizations across, different industry verticals or geographies, what are they seeing? It can also potentially maybe factor into what the probability is that a certain threat might impact you in the future. For example, if there's an increasing trend of a certain malware detection in, let's say, the retail industry, and you're a retail organization, maybe you're not seeing this yet, but because it's affecting other retail organizations, it might be something that you think that you have a higher probability of being impacted by that in the future. Additionally, it can tell you whether or not a threat is being targeted at you sometimes. That's a question that we often get, is this campaign specifically targeting me? And sometimes you can get a quick answer to that just by looking at telemetry data and seeing what the top malware detections are. If you have a particular malware family that's appearing in the top detections, that's probably a good indicator that it's not a targeted threat.
So another point that I wanted to highlight is the difference between quantitative and qualitative data. Most of the time when we're dealing with telemetry, we're generating top 10 statistics for industry verticals or regions, we're essentially counting volume. And as we know, if you went to any of the other talks pretty much at CDS, you'll note that highly targeted attacks are often extremely low volume. They're going after specific organizations, and that kind of stuff is never going to rise up to the level of a top 10 across all of our telemetry data. So what we try to do is look at the volume counts and identify the high volume malware, but also look qualitatively at the types of malware that we're seeing coming in from incident response engagements, malware that the espionage analysis team is identifying as being used within a particular time frame, and balance that out against our quantitative reporting.
Two other terms that we wanted to bring up with you before we dive into some of the specifics are targeted versus impacted. These are two terms that I think are used highly inconsistency across the board. People use them and they mean completely different things. Whenever we're looking at data and looking at specific threats, whenever we think about targeted in a very pure sense, what does this mean? This means that there's a threat actor targeting a specific organization to achieve a particular mission. And the only way that they can achieve that mission is by targeting your specific organization. There's also this gray area, right? So there's some threat actors who might specialize in targeting a particular geographic region because they have the necessary resources there to monetize an operation, such as money mules. Or there might be certain actors who are targeting organizations in a particular sector because maybe they specialize in payment card data theft, so they want to target organizations that have a high volume of consumer transactions. On the complete other end of the spectrum, you also have mass-wide distributed threats. So most of the time, this is going to be associated with your financially motivated actors again. These are criminals that they just want to target as many organizations and individuals as possible to increase their profitability.
So we're going to jump into some of the distortionary factors in the data sets that need to be accounted for if you want to represent accurate data. So if we want to get past some of these conflicting headlines, we want to critically understand what we're looking at when we're seeing different trends. These are the factors that you need to take into account when reading reports based on telemetry data. So the first one is sensor placement and type. So depending on the type of sensor, whether it's endpoint, network, email, you're dealing with different types of data, and depending on where that sensor is placed, whether it's at the first line of defense or last line of defense, you're going to be dealing with different levels of volume. The other factor that we find quite often is data pollution. Some of it is just a labeling issue, so there's detections that are mislabeled. Other times it can be testing data. Customers want to know that their products are functioning correctly, so they'll dump a bunch of test data in there, and that often finds its way into statistical reporting. It could also include really old malware that might still be around. And finally, the client base. If an organization is really operating in a niche market or doesn't have a global perspective or maybe a really strong regional perspective, that can affect the type of data and how you would interpret it. So the other thing I want to talk about is the direction. The direction of the event that you're counting matters to your count. So if you're dealing with email detections, for example, and I really like email, it's probably the most common attack vector that we see. Email is nice and clean because one inbound event gets counted as one. And if they send 100 emails, then that gets counted as 100. And it makes it nice and clean. And then also you have the timestamps of when the email was sent, which sets your temporal boundary nicely. When you're dealing with outbound events, like things that are detected at the network level, for example, that can start getting a little confusing because one single infection of a really noisy piece of malware might generate hundreds of beacons to a command and control server, each of which are tripping an alert. So really, you don't want to count those things as 100 when it's just one infection, but oftentimes that distinction isn't made, which is why you often see malware families with worm capability or P file infectors consistently in the top 10 counts that are put out every quarter, even though it might be something like Configure, which was an issue 10 years ago, but isn't a relevant threat to most organizations right now. So I wanted to go through the three main types of sensors and talk a little bit about the main things that you want to think about when you're dealing with data coming from those types of sensors. So with email, the big problem with email is that you might not get the level of specificity that you want in a detection. For example, a lot of distribution networks that we track on the cybercrime side, they'll send an email with a malicious link. And sometimes the payload on the end of that link is geofenced. So you have to be in the right country to even get the payload. So we might be able to detect that this email is malicious, but we might not be able to specifically say what type of malware payload is on the other end. And sometimes it's even worse than that, because the payload on the other end is actually just a Word document with a malicious macro that then connects somewhere else to pull down the payload. So email is nice and easy for counting volume because you have that singular event that makes it easy to count, but sometimes the type of detections that you're looking at don't lend itself nicely to making a determination of what malware family is actually being distributed. Network is the complete opposite. Because a lot of malware families have a distinctive beacon to the command and control server, you can identify it really nicely. We know that this network traffic is associated with this particular piece of malware, but then we run into the volume problem. High beaconing malware is going to distort the statistics, push it up to the top when it might not be something that's actually prominent within the industry vertical or geographic region that you're looking at. And finally, with endpoint, endpoint is nice because it's kind of telling you what's getting through. It's getting, whatever you're seeing on your endpoint is getting past your email detection, your network detection. That in itself is interesting. But especially on the cybercrime side, with all of the packers and cryptors that are in play, these are basically tools that you can purchase on underground forums and marketplaces that essentially encrypt and protect the malware payload. And so these can get detected by the endpoint, but they won't always tell you exactly what malware family it is. So we see a lot of behavioral detections on the endpoint, which is interesting, but doesn't necessarily tell you exactly what family is in play.
Another thing that we want to talk about is old malware. Andromeda is a great example of this. This is a malware that is a downloader with credential theft capabilities that was first available in underground forums in July 2011. If we flash forward to 2012, late in that year, the source code for this malware in its builder was actually leaked, which led to a wide proliferation of Andromeda campaigns that were being conducted by multiple threat actors. Late last year, there was actually some law enforcement action that was jointly taken with organizations in the security field where they were able to disrupt more than 460 distinct Andromeda botnets. As part of this operation, what they did was sinkhole many of the command and control domains associated with these operations. So here you can see, if we look at our detections over this time frame, you can see when the arrest of this individual, there was also an individual who was arrested as part of that operation in Belarus. That individual, when he was arrested, we saw a sharp decline in Andromeda detections. But what's interesting is that we continue to see Andromeda detections. When we looked a little bit deeper into that data, it turns out that pretty much all of them, were beaconing to sinkhole command and control infrastructure. So they were likely indicative of older infections that maybe weren't properly remediated. And so if you're an organization looking at this data, if you know that, then this might not be a threat that you want to prioritize or that you might care about that much.
Another interesting case that we saw earlier this year, and this is near and dear to my heart because GhostRat was the first piece of malware that I ever really looked at. And we wrote a really awesome report called GhostNet. It's really old now. But I saw a lot of GhostRat beaconing happening in our data set. And I got really excited. I was like, are these guys back? Should I jump back onto the cyber espionage side now that I'm on crimeware? What's going on here? So I started looking into it. And really what it turned out what was happening is, you all know what Shodan is? It's basically like a search engine for security people that indexes a lot of data like HTTP headers from servers. They scan the entire internet. And they started a project looking for controllers for a bunch of different rats. And Ghost was one of them. So what we were actually seeing was Shodan scanning the entire internet. And the way that some customers had their appliances set up is that it was detecting both inbound and outbound events. So it was seeing the pattern of the GhostRat beacon, but all on inbound events. And I just wanted to highlight the other rats that were part of that Shodan malware scanner, including NetBus, which is from 1998. And if you're seeing NetBus in your environment, then you have a real problem.
Another thing that we want to think about, which Nart briefly mentioned earlier, is what are the customers or who are the customers of the security organization or security company that is reporting these statistics to you? Generally, every security vendor is going to have a little bit of bias in terms of their customers, and so that affects what visibility they have into certain threats. So for example, a regional antivirus vendor might have great visibility into what's happening in a specific region, but they're not really that well poised to tell you what's going on globally. The same thing when you look at industry. For example, if you have a security organization that primarily works with organizations in the ICS industry, they probably have great visibility into what's affecting those organizations, but they can't broadly talk about what threats are impacting industries across the board. Another thing that you want to think about is how is the security organization defining which buckets they are putting their customers into? For example, there's several organizations that have a global presence. Whenever they're talking about those organizations and the threats that are impacting them, are they grouping them into a separate global bucket, or are they grouping them into maybe the country where that organization is headquartered? Nart mentioned email data a little bit earlier, and email data is actually great for us whenever we're looking at specific campaigns because you can see who the individual recipient was. So you can get a little bit more granular and actually talk about who was impacted by this particular threat. So for example, maybe it's a global organization that's based in the UK, but they have an office in, let's say, Singapore, and you can see based on the email detections that you have that these phishing emails were sent to the employees in Singapore. So whenever you're writing about this activity, at least from our perspective, we can then characterize that a little bit better for our customers.
So knowing all of these distortionary factors, we wanted to talk a little bit about how we're accounting for data distortion in our reporting so that we can try to present the most impactful threats per industry or geographic region in our reporting. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was the difference between a signature and a malware family. So we take a lot of effort to identify what we call code families. These are essentially representative families of a particular code base. Once we have that established, we can start to look at minor variations, new versions that appear over time, look at the difference in functionality, but still kind of group that together as one code family. And this is important because, especially with cybercrime actors that are in the business of selling malware, they will often take the exact same malware they've been selling, call it something new, change the color scheme in the builder from blue to green, and try to sell it again on the underground forums as something totally new. So we end up with a case where there's like a single actual family from a code perspective that has a lot of different names. So what we do is we try to make sure that we track malware as a code family, and then we try to map all of the different signatures that we have depending on what type of product is doing the detection to that malware family. That way we're not tracking volume of signatures, we're actually tracking a group of signatures that represents a malware family. And that gives us a little more accuracy when we're trying to determine where and how a malware family is being spread. The other thing that we do is we assign a primary role to all of the code families. That way we can track groupings of malware families that have the same types of capabilities, like credential theft malware or keyloggers or backdoors. That way we can see trends in the distribution of malware based on their behavior, not just based on their family. And finally, we create another thing that we call a methodology bucket. And basically, this allows us to group signatures that don't determine what the malware family is, but try to determine the type of malicious behavior that's been detected. So this is really useful, for example, to try to look at usage of PowerShell in a malicious way over time. So we group together all of the signatures that detect on malicious PowerShell usage so that we can see that behavior. Another good one is packers and cryptors. Like I mentioned earlier, cybercriminals especially use this to disguise the payload. They do it to try to avoid detection. But from our point of view, the usage of packers and cryptors is also interesting. So we group those together. We also group together all of our detections that correspond to specific vulnerabilities or CVEs. So we group them by CVE detection so we can try to track usage of different exploits over time. So in terms of presenting this, one of the things that we were trying to do is to not totally rely on volume for a lot of reasons. The simple one is we're often dealing with noisy malware. So if we generated top 10 threat for this quarter or this month or this week, the most noisiest, probably oldest malware is going to bubble up to the top. If you read any kind of quarterly reports that come out or yearly reports about malware detection statistics, you will see ancient malware, worms, file infectors, things that are not relevant necessarily for the time period that you're looking at. So what we tried to do was develop a method to minimize outliers and only show the malware families that were most significant to the specific industry vertical or geographic region that we're dealing with. So the way that we do it is we take all of the telemetry data, we take all of the signature hits, collapse them into malware families, and sort them by volume. Then what we do is we calculate a breadth percentage for industry verticals, regions, and countries. So out of all of the customers that we have, what's the percentage of customers that in an industry vertical that have actually seen this threat? That way, if there's a single customer that has an unremediated old infection, it'll never show up in our top 10. So we start with a floor of 100%. Are there any malware families where 100% of the hits are in this particular industry vertical? And then we de-increment by 1, so we have basically a floating floor that's, depending on the industry vertical, somewhere usually between about 10 and 25%. So that way, what we're actually measuring is not just volume, but impact within an industry vertical.
So once you've done, some of these things, whenever you're looking at the data to kind of account for some of the distortionary factors, or you've taken into consideration who it is that's reporting you this data and where it's coming from, you can then potentially start to answer some more strategic and operational questions. So for example, maybe it's giving you visibility into a threat that your organization isn't that well poised to defend against. So maybe you can start thinking about what resources or technology do I need to put in place today to defend against it. Operationally, it can also give you insight into potentially prioritization for what threats you need to maybe have your hunt team go out and actively look for. We're going to run through a few scenarios here where we're looking at some detections and we're looking at, well, what kinds of things can we ask the data? Or what kind of questions can we answer if we have a little bit more information. For each of these scenarios, we're going to look at it from the viewpoint of a particular organization in a different industry or geographical region, depending on what's applicable. Otherwise, we would just be essentially giving you generic advice when you're looking at these. So in this case, we are a Latin American financial institution, and we have a security vendor who is telling us that almost 50% of the detections for CVEs that they saw in this past month were associated with this 2017 vulnerability. Obviously, operationally, you would probably want to know, do we have any vulnerable systems? If we do, because this appears to be so prolific, we might want to prioritize the patching of those vulnerable systems. But if you take a step back and you think about, well, who's using this vulnerability? In this case, we know that this vulnerability has actually been incorporated into several document exploit builders that are sold in underground forums. One of those is called ThreadKit, which is being sold by an actor named Mr. Bass. We know that Mr. Bass has several customers. Some of these customers are responsible for distribution of more mass spread spam campaigns. But there's also one customer, Mr. Bass, that would probably be more interesting to you if you were a Latin American financial institution. And that customer is TempMetaStrike. That's a group that is publicly called Cobalt Group, and they are responsible for targeting financial institutions across the globe. We've seen campaigns being sent to financial organizations in more than 30 countries. To you as a financial institution, this would be pretty interesting, especially if you had identified vulnerable systems. It would also be interesting to you to know that several of their recent campaigns have actually targeted financial institutions in Latin America specifically. So if you did have vulnerable systems, you might want to understand what are the TTPs that this group employs at later stages of the attack lifecycle that maybe you need to go hunt in your environment to make sure that one of these campaigns wasn't actually successful. In this scenario, we're looking at this from the perspective of a Polish organization who had previously seen high volumes of NIMEM campaigns. NIMEM is a banking malware, and in this case, if you look at the data and you're a Polish organization, you see, okay, this threat was previously impacting me, but now it's just primarily impacting German organizations. So at first glance, maybe you're happy, right? Maybe this is a threat you can deprioritize now. But if you actually go back in time and you look at the data, you can see that there appears to be a cyclical targeting scheme with this particular operation where they consistently go back and forth between targeting German individuals and organizations and then targeting Polish individuals and organizations. So if you have that additional perspective, you can then say, well, maybe I shouldn't deprioritize this. Maybe I should keep tabs on, is there anything changing in the distribution tactics that they're using that I need to make sure that I have detections in place so that I can defend against this when it comes back around to target Polish individuals and organizations again in the future. For those of you that aren't familiar with Emotet, Emotet is a very high volume threat that consistently appears within our top detections every month. If you're an organization, though, that had previously never seen Emotet on your perimeter, and all of a sudden you're seeing this huge spike, that could be alarming to you. And one of the first questions that you would want to ask is, is this something that's just impacting me, or is this impacting everybody? You can easily get that answer by looking at telemetry data to see, there's constant high volume spam campaigns that are targeting various organizations regardless of industry, regardless of geography. Another thing that would be important for you to know, again here we're looking at this from the perspective of a global financial institution, is that Emotet is responsible for the distribution of secondary payloads. Emotet itself in the past had been associated directly with banking fraud because it does have a banking module that it's capable of loading. However, since the beginning of 2017, we haven't actually seen it load that module. Instead, what it's doing is it's distributing secondary payloads. One of the criteria that it appears to be using to determine which secondary payloads it's going to download is what is the geography of the victim machine. So in this case, we've seen them distribute PandaBot in the United States and Canada. Again, if you recall, maybe don't recall from the last slide, this organization that we're pretending to be right now, its URL is appearing within PandaBot configuration files. And what that means is that there are threat actors who want to capture the credentials of its customers, right? So that it can perform account takeover operations in fraudulent transactions. In this case, since you know that PandaBot is being distributed through Emotet, which is a high volume threat, to individuals and organizations in the United States and Canada, PandaBot would be the payload. And in this case, you can potentially proactively send out some warnings to maybe your financial institution customers to let them know that here's the lures that this malware is using right now, so that they're able to recognize that. There might be some additional things that you can do, maybe with having stricter fraud controls for customers that are located in this particular region. And maybe there's some additional analysis that you can conduct on the malware to potentially see what does it look like if the attacker is initiating a web session versus what does it look like if my customer is initiating a legitimate web session. In those cases, you can prioritize detections or additional analysis to identify what those might be. The final scenario that we're going to look at is ransomware. So ransomware historically has been associated, with it's a high volume threat. Healthcare organizations have been highly susceptible to this threat for various reasons, right? One of them being that several of them are running outdated operating systems. So in this case, you're a healthcare organization and you notice that you're not seeing as many ransomware detections. Again, one of the first questions that you might want to ask is, are we not seeing these detections because the malware has become more evasive, and so we're not catching it right away? Obviously, with ransomware, that's a pretty easy question to just like look around at the workstations and answer. Do they have ransomware messages flashing on them or not? For other threats, that it might not be as obvious, right? But in this case, you can query your vendor and you can see, okay, well, they're also saying that if we compare Q1 of 2017 and Q1 of 2018, we've actually seen a decline overall. For me, one of the questions that I would want myself and my team to be thinking about is, well, why are we seeing less detections? Is the ransomware threat going away? What's happening here? And so whenever we looked at this data, we came up with various factors that we thought was contributing to this trend. For the purposes of this, one of the most important reasons that we saw was that there was a shift for at least some actors in how they were distributing ransomware. So they weren't distributing it as the initial payload. One good example of that is the SamSam ransomware, and the operators behind this particular ransomware family have deployed the malware as a later stage and initially gained access to the victim environments by exploiting vulnerable web servers. So in this case, if you know that, hey, there's some actors who are, gaining initial access into victim environments first by exploiting these vulnerable web servers, then you can potentially conduct a scan of your network to see if you have any vulnerable systems, again, to prioritize that patching. So now to just recap and why did we really talk about any of this stuff, especially in the beginning when we said all this stuff is, kind of conflicting, right? So the bottom line with all of these headlines is that, not all of them are wrong. Some of them definitely are wrong, but in order to figure out which ones are right, which ones are credible, and which ones are actually relevant to you, you need to do a bit more research into the organization and who's actually reporting these statistics.
So kind of to reiterate what Kimberly is saying, these type of headlines that are saying, hey, we saw this many events, or there was an increase of this kind of percentage, they catch your attention, and there's a high demand for this kind of reporting. People love statistical roll-up reports at the end of a quarter, at the end of a year. And I think what we have been trying to show is that although there's a lot of problems with the data, being able to critically understand the type of data that's being reported and being able to adapt that as you're reading it to how it would impact your organization operationally and strategically can be valuable. You just need to be aware of both the pros and the cons of the certain type of data that's going into the report. So the way I tend to break it down as I'm reading some of these reports and as I'm creating them is I'm trying to look at what's the sensor technology that's being deployed? Is it endpoint? Is it network? Is it email? And you can often tell that by the company that's putting out the report. If it's a report that's coming out from a traditional AV vendor, then it's probably going to be endpoint data. If it's a firewall company, it's probably going to be network data. And that helps you kind of interpret what you're looking at and why some might be seeing a rise in certain types of malware while others see a decline. And then I look at, in the report, is there a section detailing the methodology? Like, how are they calculating this? Is this just strictly a volume count? Usually that's pretty apparent. If Configure is in the top 10, then they're just counting volume, right? Also the specificity. Are they dealing with signatures? Are they dealing with malware families? Are there generic detections in the top 10? If you have like js.cryptic.10, whatever, it's like, what is that? How can you take action on a generic detection like that? But if the methodology is clearly outlined and they're talking about malicious JavaScript usage, then that might actually be valuable. And finally, I try to determine the audience. Like, is this a marketing report that's going out that kind of looks cool but doesn't have a lot of actionable data? Or is this targeted more towards operators or SOC people or executives that are making decisions? Because depending on the audience you're going for, you're going to present and frame the data in a different way. And finally, reputation. Is this organization consistently producing reliable reports, or are they getting called out all the time or having to correct them? And the last thing is just looking at if there are any obvious concentrations in customer base. Like, is this organization operating in a niche market or in just one particular part of the world? Because that data might be really great for that location, but if they're talking about a trend globally, maybe their data isn't so great somewhere else.
Yep. And so once you've done that, or once you've evaluated whether those actions have been taken, in the case that they were, you can then kind of start putting the pieces together to start to answer some of these categorical questions that we mentioned earlier. So again, just to reiterate, visibility, is this threat impacting other organizations or industries? What's the probability that maybe a certain threat might impact me in the future? Maybe I saw a headline about some new ransomware, and I want to see, where have organizations seen this ransomware being, deployed at? It can also potentially, help to tell you what's the impact of a particular malware family or a particular threat. So is this something that's specifically targeting you, or is this something that's being broadly distributed? And I hope that this was one thread that was kind of evident while we were going through some of these scenarios, right? The telemetry data that people are reporting is very superficial. It just tells you oftentimes what the initial detection was. It doesn't go further to tell you, maybe like in the case of Emotet, that it's distributing secondary payloads. That's not something that you would get from telemetry data. It also certainly doesn't tell you why you are seeing certain threats. And it doesn't tell you who is behind certain threats. And in order to glean that information, you really need to have a large knowledge base, or maybe an intelligence, threat intelligence provider that you can query and ask these questions to, like, please give me the background on this threat. Unless you have that, you're not really going to be able to action a lot of this data in the way that you would be if you did have that knowledge base. So I think at this time, we'll open it up for questions, if anybody has any.
Great job, guys. So if you have any questions, please make your way to one of the mics in any of the locations, and we'll answer it. I will kick it off with one of them, which is, I guess first, where and how often are you creating telemetry-based reports, and can folks get access to those? How does that occur?
So we do quarterly reports that regularly go out, and then we do custom reports for clients sometimes on a monthly or even weekly basis.
Yeah. Yeah, so it depends on certain things, right? So one of the reports that we look at this data monthly for is for our financial sector customers. We put together different trends that we're seeing across the board in terms of CVE detections, in terms of phishing lures used, what document types are actors using, what's the malware family that's most prolific this month. But in addition to that, when we're rating reports, we also query this data, right? So if we saw a particular campaign, I'm going to go back and I'm going to look through the data to see if we've seen that threat at any other organizations across our customer base. So in addition to creating these trending reports, we also use this data to look at specific threats to give us a bit more insight into how broad it might be.
Great, thank you. And I guess one other question is, with our own telemetry data here at FireEye, was there anything particularly challenging about working with our stuff that may be unique to us?
Well, all the challenges that we went through.
Yeah.
I think what we were trying to do is identify, be honest with ourselves and identify the challenges that we had and look to put measures in place to be able to account for that data distortion so that customers can take action on that data. A lot of customers use it as a sanity check, for example. I'm seeing these type of hits. Are peer organizations like me or organizations in my geographic region also seeing this? If we're not seeing something that other people are seeing, does that mean that we potentially have a visibility gap in our own network? So our main challenge was going through making sure that we were intellectually honest with the data and being able to give the customers data that they could actually take action on.
Great.
Yeah. And then also just from my perspective, generic detections are really challenging just because, what does that really tell you? And if you have so many generic detections, it's really a challenge to bubble up things that might be new and interesting in reporting or interesting for reporting that you might want to do, because it's just being detected as something generically, and you have so many things that are being detected with generic detections, and you can't easily identify what's important.
Right, so for us on the virtual execution side, if we call something malware.binary, that's probably not terribly useful on the telemetry side, right?
Yeah, that gives me a headache.
Understood, me too. Great, well, thank you for the talk.